German U-boat commanders receiving intelligence reports in February of 1944 found themselves struggling to actually believe what those same reports were telling them. A single British escort group, commanded by one captain aboard one flagship, had reportedly destroyed 3 separate U-boats within 16 hours during a single continuous hunt. A kill rate no U-boat command staff had actually believed any Allied escort force could realistically sustain against trained, experienced German submarine crews. The reports were accurate. Captain Frederick John Walker had actually done it, and by the time the war ended, ships under his own direct command had sunk more U-boats than any other single commander in the entire history of naval warfare. This is the story of Captain Walker's 2nd Escort Group and the specific hunting method German U-boat commanders spent the war's own final years actually struggling to counter. Every week we take apart a moment when a war turned, the technology that decided it, and the razor-thin margin between disaster and victory. Subscribe if that is the kind of history you want more of. Frederick John Walker had actually spent the early years of the war watching other officers advance past him, passed over for promotion twice before the war even began. A career naval officer whose own superiors apparently doubted whether he actually possessed the specific temperament senior command actually required. That same skepticism nearly ended his own naval career entirely before the Battle of the Atlantic ever gave him a genuine opportunity to actually prove otherwise. When Walker finally received command of the 36th Escort Group in October of 1941, escorting Gibraltar convoys through waters, German U-boats had already turned into some of the most dangerous shipping lanes in the entire war. He began developing tactical innovations that would eventually transform how the Royal Navy actually hunted submarines for the remainder of the entire conflict. Before we get into exactly what those specific tactical innovations actually were, if you are finding this useful, hit subscribe. It costs nothing and it helps the channel keep telling these stories. Here is the specific tactical method that actually made Walker's own approach so consistently effective against an enemy that had already sunk considerable Allied tonnage using conventional escort tactics. Most Royal Navy captains still relied on through the war's own middle years. Conventional anti-submarine doctrine typically involved a single escort vessel detecting a submerged U-boat by sonar, then attacking directly with depth charges dropped from the same ship maintaining sonar contact, a method that suffered from one genuine persistent problem: the attacking ship's own depth charges detonating while she was still passing directly overhead. Often destroyed her own sonar contact with the target in the exact critical seconds immediately before the charges actually exploded, meaning the U-boat frequently had just enough warning to actually maneuver clear before the attack ever landed. Walker developed what became known as the creeping attack specifically to solve that same fundamental problem. One ship maintaining continuous sonar contact with the target from a stationary or slow-moving position, while a second ship, guided entirely by information relayed from the first vessel, approached the U-boat's own position from a different bearing and dropped depth charges without ever needing her own sonar to actually track the target directly. That specific division of labor meant the U-boat commander below the surface had no reliable way to actually anticipate exactly when or from which direction the fatal attack would actually arrive, since the ship maintaining sonar contact never actually attacked at all, and the ship actually delivering the depth charges approached using nothing but relayed bearing and range information rather than her own direct sonar picture of the target. Walker refined that same technique further, sometimes employing 3 or more of his own escort vessels in a coordinated line, specifically to actually bracket a submerged U-boat from multiple directions simultaneously. A tactic considerably harder for any single submarine commander to actually evade, regardless of how skilled or how experienced that same commander actually was. Walker took command of the 2nd Support Group in the spring of 1942, commanding his own sloop HMS Starling alongside Wild Goose, Cygnet, Wren, Woodpecker, and Kite. A coordinated team of similar Black Swan-class vessels, he drilled relentlessly until the entire group could actually execute his own creeping attack doctrine with minimal verbal communication and effectively no hesitation once a genuine U-boat contact had actually been established. That same group would go on to become, by any reasonable measure available to naval historians studying the entire war, the most successful anti-submarine hunting force fielded by either side across the entire conflict, sinking considerably more U-boats than any comparable formation the Royal Navy, the United States Navy, or any other allied nation actually deployed against Germany's own submarine fleet throughout the war's own middle and final years. Here is exactly what happened during the specific patrol that actually cemented Walker's own reputation among German U-boat commanders as an opponent worth seriously fearing, rather than simply another conventional escort commander following standard Admiralty doctrine. Departing Liverpool on January the 29th, 1944, to the sound of the group's own adopted theme song playing over Starling's loudspeakers, Walker's ships began what would become a 27-day cruise through the western approaches that historians studying the Battle of the Atlantic still regard as the single most successful anti-submarine patrol any escort group actually achieved across the entire war. The group sank U-592 on January the 31st, then on February the 9th achieved the specific feat that actually shocked German Naval Command once accurate reports finally reached Berlin, destroying U-762, U-734, and U-238 within a span of roughly 16 hours during a single continuous overlapping series of coordinated attacks. Wild Goose actually established the first contact of that same extraordinary day at approximately 6:15 in the morning, roughly 10 miles from the convoy the group was actually escorting home, immediately calling Starling to actually begin a creeping attack that continued for 3 hours and 25 minutes before finally destroying U-734 beneath the waves. At almost exactly that same moment, HMS Kite, following a radio direction finding bearing, actually sighted U-238 barely 800 yards away, emerging briefly from morning mist before diving immediately once her own crew realized they had actually been spotted. Kite, later joined by Magpie, maintained a long, patient vigil against that same elusive, well-handled U-boat, expending nearly her own entire depth charge supply before Starling and Wild Goose finally arrived from their own earlier successful attack. Walker then directing Magpie through a coordinated creeping attack that began with a Hedgehog mortar salvo and continued with conventional depth charges until U-238 had also actually been destroyed. This is not a story about overwhelming numerical advantage simply grinding down an outmatched opponent through sheer weight of Allied resources alone, since German U-boat crews operating in early 1944 remained considerably skilled, considerably experienced submariners who had already spent years successfully evading considerably less sophisticated escort tactics deployed against them throughout the war's own earlier years. It is a story about how thoroughly a single coordinated tactical innovation, dividing sonar tracking and depth charge delivery between separate vessels working in careful, rehearsed coordination, could systematically defeat an enemy who had no comparable answer to a hunting method built specifically around denying that same enemy any reliable way to actually predict where or when the fatal attack would actually arrive. One specific engagement from June of 1943 illustrates exactly how thoroughly Walker's own tactical reputation had already begun affecting individual German commanders even before his own most famous 16-hour stretch the following February. Kapitan Lieutenant Günther Poser, commanding U-202 on her 9th operational patrol after successfully landing 5 German agents on Long Island's own Amagansett Beach, spotted mastheads through his own periscope on June the 13th, and immediately recognized what he was actually looking at. "Destroyers," he reportedly exclaimed to his own watch officer, the specific dread in that single word reflecting exactly the reputation Walker's group had already begun building among experienced U-boat commanders who understood precisely what kind of coordinated patient hunt they were now actually facing. Walker's group sank U-202 that same month, followed by U-119 and U-449 on June the 24th alone, meaning Walker had already personally accounted for 3 separate U-boat kills within a single day months before his own more famous February achievement, a detail that further undermines any notion that his own later 16-hour stretch represented an isolated fluke rather than the natural, repeatable outcome of a considerably superior tactical method applied consistently across an extended operational career. The specific engagement against U-473 in 1944 further demonstrated exactly how relentlessly Walker actually pursued a target once his group had established initial contact. A lengthy chase that concluded successfully only after Walker's ships had already tracked the U-boat across a considerably extended pursuit. Most conventional escort commanders would likely have abandoned considerably earlier given the sheer time and fuel investment such an extended hunt actually required. That same willingness to actually commit disproportionate time and resources toward finishing a single kill, rather than simply moving on toward easier or more immediately available targets, reflected Walker's own broader operational philosophy. That a partially damaged or temporarily evaded U-boat represented a genuine ongoing threat to future convoys, meaning the additional hours or even days spent actually completing a kill already begun represented time well spent regardless of the immediate opportunity cost involved in continuing that same extended pursuit rather than seeking a fresh target elsewhere. German Naval Command's own genuine difficulty believing these reports reflected more than simple wounded pride at recording such considerable losses to a single Allied formation. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commanding the entire U-boat fleet and himself a former submarine commander from the First World War with direct personal understanding of exactly how difficult detecting and evading a well-handled escort vessel actually was, had built German submarine doctrine specifically around the assumption that a skilled U-boat commander could reliably evade conventional single-ship depth charge attacks through careful maneuvering and patient waiting beneath the surface. Walker's creeping attack method directly undermined that same foundational assumption, since the entire tactic depended on denying the U-boat commander exactly the kind of predictable attack pattern his own doctrine had trained him to actually anticipate and evade through conventional evasive maneuvering. The broader patrol that included that specific 16-hour stretch continued producing results. German Naval Command found increasingly difficult to reconcile with their own understanding of Allied anti-submarine capability. The group sank U-424 on February the 11th, and Walker himself, aboard Starling, personally scored the patrol's own final kill on February the 19th, destroying U-264 roughly 700 miles west of Land's End, using an extended assault his own crew nicknamed Operation Plaster, subjecting the doomed submarine to something in the range of 200 depth charges across more than 10 continuous hours, until water was reportedly sloshing around her own crew's ankles well before the boat actually went down entirely. 6 confirmed U-boat kills across that single 27-day patrol, against a broader total of 11 U-boats destroyed by all Allied forces combined across the entire Atlantic during that same 4-week period, meant Walker's own single group had accounted for more than half of every U-boat sunk anywhere in the Atlantic that specific month. Walker's own operational success cannot actually be fully understood in isolation from the broader intelligence advantages the Allies had already developed. By the time his second support group actually began its own most successful operations in 1943 and 1944, British codebreakers at Bletchley Park had already achieved considerable success reading German naval Enigma traffic by this same period, providing Allied convoy planners with genuine advance warning about likely U-boat patrol areas that let escort groups like Walker's actually position themselves in locations where a genuine encounter was already considerably more probable than pure chance alone would have otherwise provided. That same intelligence advantage never actually diminished the significance of Walker's own tactical innovations, since knowing roughly where U-boats were likely operating still required an effective method for actually detecting, tracking, and destroying an individual submarine once contact had actually been established. Exactly the specific problem Walker's creeping attack doctrine had actually been developed to solve. The combination of improved intelligence positioning escort groups in generally productive hunting areas and Walker's own considerably more effective tactical method for actually completing kills once contact occurred meant his group's own extraordinary success rate reflected the convergence of multiple separate Allied advantages rather than any single isolated factor operating entirely on its own. The broader technological context surrounding Walker's own operations deserves attention as well, since the sonar and depth charge technology his ships actually employed had also improved considerably across the war's own middle years, incorporating refinements that made the creeping attack doctrine itself considerably more effective than earlier. Cruder anti-submarine equipment could have realistically supported even had Walker attempted the same basic tactical approach several years earlier in the war. Improved Type 144 and Type 147 sonar sets gave Walker's ships considerably more precise depth and bearing information than earlier equipment had provided, while the Hedgehog forward-throwing mortar system, which launched a pattern of small explosive projectiles ahead of the attacking ship rather than simply rolling depth charges off the stern, allowed an attacking vessel to actually maintain sonar contact with the target throughout the entire attack run, rather than losing that same contact during the final approach the way conventional stern-mounted depth charge attacks routinely required. That specific technological combination, improved detection equipment paired with a weapon system that did not require sacrificing sonar contact during the actual attack itself, meant Walker's own tactical innovations arrived at almost exactly the moment the underlying technology had finally matured enough to actually support them effectively in genuine combat conditions. Walker's own tactical philosophy extended well beyond the creeping attack alone, incorporating genuine psychological insight into how an experienced U-boat commander would actually think and react once he understood he was actually being hunted by a skilled, aggressive escort group rather than a conventional, more passive convoy screen. Officers who served directly under Walker later described his own remarkable ability to actually predict where a diving U-boat commander would attempt to maneuver based purely on tactical logic, working out an enemy's most probable evasive course specifically by reasoning through what he himself would actually do, commanding that same submarine under those exact circumstances, then directing his own ships toward that same predicted position, rather than simply reacting to whatever sonar contact happened to actually develop next. One officer serving in HMS Wren specifically recalled an occasion when Walker's group had 60 miles still to travel to reach a U-boat sighted by aircraft, calculating that during the 3 hours required to actually close that distance, the submerged U-boat could have traveled up to 18 miles in any conceivable direction, yet Walker correctly worked out exactly where the enemy commander would actually choose to go and directed his own ships accordingly, arriving to find the U-boat almost precisely where he had predicted. The specific vessels comprising Walker's second support group deserve genuine attention in their own right as well, since the Black Swan-class sloops he actually commanded were never originally designed as dedicated submarine hunters in the way the term destroyer typically implies to most casual observers of naval history. These ships measured 283 feet in length, displacing between 1,300 and 1,350 tons depending on the specific vessel. Capable of 19 to 20 knots, considerably slower than a genuine fleet destroyer built specifically for high-speed surface combat against comparable enemy warships. What the sloops lacked in raw speed, they more than compensated for in operational endurance, their own considerably more fuel-efficient engines allowing Walker's group to actually remain on station hunting U-boats for weeks at a time without needing to return to port for refueling. Exactly the kind of sustained presence the creeping attack doctrine actually required to systematically wear down and eventually destroy a patient, well-handled U-boat commander determined to actually survive the encounter. Walker's own personal cost from this same relentless operational tempo proved considerable as well. The captain reportedly rarely resting throughout his own years commanding the 2nd Support Group, driving himself with the same intensity he had already demonstrated hunting the U-boats his own group had already sunk in such considerable numbers. He died on July 9, 1944, from what naval physicians at the time attributed to accumulated overstrain, overwork, and genuine battle fatigue, passing away barely 5 weeks after the Normandy landings his own group had helped secure against German U-boat interference. Never actually living to see the war's own eventual conclusion, he had already done so much to actually help bring about through his own group's sustained methodical destruction of Germany's own submarine fleet. By the time of his own death, ships under Walker's direct command had sunk 20 separate U-boats across his own naval career, with HMS Starling herself specifically credited with 15 confirmed kills, a figure Guinness World Records has since formally recognized as the highest number of U-boat kills ever attributed to any single ship across the entire Second World War. That specific record has never actually been surpassed by any other vessel from any nation involved in the broader Battle of the Atlantic, a genuine testament to exactly how effectively Walker's own tactical innovations, developed and refined across years of continuous operational experience, actually transformed his own group's hunting effectiveness compared against more conventional escort formations still relying on doctrine that had already proven considerably less effective against experienced German submarine crews. German U-boat crews who actually survived encounters with Walker's group frequently described the specific psychological toll of facing an enemy who seemed to actually anticipate their own evasive maneuvers before those same maneuvers had even actually been executed. A considerably more unsettling experience than facing a conventional escort simply reacting to sonar contacts as they happened to develop. Post-war interviews with surviving German submariners specifically referenced Walker's group by name as among the most feared Allied anti-submarine formations any U-boat crew could actually encounter during a wartime patrol, a reputation that had already spread throughout the German submarine service well before the war's own conclusion. U-boat commanders reportedly altering their own patrol routes specifically to actually avoid areas where Walker's group was believed to actually be operating whenever intelligence suggested his own ships might actually be present. This is not a story about a single dramatic engagement deciding the outcome of the entire Battle of the Atlantic, since Walker's own group represented one formation among many Allied forces actually contributing to Germany's own eventual submarine defeat across the war's own final years. It is a story about how thoroughly one officer's own patient tactical innovation, developed specifically to address a genuine, well-understood weakness in conventional anti-submarine doctrine, could transform an ordinary group of unglamorous escort sloops into the single most successful submarine hunting force either side actually fielded across the entire war, A transformation built not on superior technology or overwhelming numerical advantage, but on Walker's own genuine tactical insight into exactly how to defeat an enemy. Commander's own reasonable, well-trained expectations about how a conventional escort attack would actually unfold. Walker's own death barely 5 weeks after Normandy prompted considerable public mourning across Britain. His own funeral procession through Liverpool drawing crowds of civilians and naval personnel alike, who had already come to regard the unglamorous business of convoy escort duty as somehow considerably more heroic, once Walker's own group had demonstrated exactly how decisively that same seemingly mundane assignment could actually be transformed into offensive, aggressive hunting rather than purely defensive, reactive protection. Winston Churchill himself later specifically praised Walker's contribution to the Battle of the Atlantic, recognizing that the systematic destruction of Germany's own U-boat fleet, achieved disproportionately through the efforts of formations like Walker's Second Support Group, had directly enabled the continued flow of American supplies and eventually troops across the Atlantic that made the entire European liberation campaign actually possible in the first place. A memorial statue of Walker now stands at Liverpool's own pier head, gazing out toward the waters where his own group had actually conducted so much of its own most consequential wartime hunting. A physical reminder of exactly how significantly one officer's own tactical innovation had actually shaped the broader outcome of the entire Atlantic campaign. Modern naval historians and tactical theorists continue studying Walker's own creeping attack method specifically as a case study in how disciplined, coordinated teamwork between multiple platforms can actually overcome an individually skilled, individually well-equipped opponent operating without any comparable coordination advantage of his own. That same basic principle, denying an opponent predictable patterns he has already trained extensively to actually anticipate and counter, has since found application well beyond naval warfare alone, referenced in broader military doctrine and organizational theory examining how smaller, more coordinated forces can actually systematically overcome opponents who might otherwise possess considerable individual skill or equipment advantages when facing a single isolated attacker acting without comparable coordination. The creeping attack doctrine Walker actually developed and refined across his own years. Commanding the Second Support Group continued influencing Royal Navy anti-submarine tactics well beyond his own death, incorporated into standard training doctrine for escort commanders across the remainder of the war, and studied extensively by post-war naval historians specifically interested in understanding exactly how tactical innovation, rather than simple material superiority alone, could actually decide a prolonged campaign fought largely beneath the ocean's own surface, where conventional advantages in speed or firepower mattered considerably less than the specific tactical sophistication actually brought to bear against a patient, skilled opponent. If you want more stories about the commanders who defeated an enemy's own expectations rather than simply his equipment, subscribe and we will keep finding them for you. See you in the next one.